The Rogue King offered millions for her head, but the Alpha King vowed to burn worlds for her. The moment Amara felt the footsteps behind her, she already knew something was wrong. It was not a feeling she could explain to anyone who had never lived alone in a city that never fully sleeps. It was something deeper than instinct, a quiet alarm in her chest that had kept her alive through years of working late shifts in hospitals where the corridors smelled like disinfectant and old grief. She had learned to trust that alarm the same way she trusted her own heartbeat. She turned her head just enough to confirm what her body already suspected. Two men, walking at the exact same pace she was walking, keeping the exact same distance between them and her, not talking to each other, not looking at their phones, just walking, following. Amara did not run. Running would tell them she knew. Instead, she turned left at the junction she always ignored on her way home, crossing into a street lined with small shops that were pulling their shutters down for the night. Her hospital identification badge was still clipped to the front of her scrubs. She had worked a 14-hour shift that day at Echo General Hospital in Lagos, and her feet were sore, and her back ached, in the way it always did, after hours of standing over patients who needed her to be still and calm when she was neither. She was 23 years old. She had been surviving on her own since she was 16, and she had never, not once in those 7 years, felt followed like this. She counted her breaths. She kept her shoulders relaxed. She moved through the evening crowd without drawing attention, the way she had always moved through the world. Quietly, practically, with the kind of presence that people noticed only after she had already passed. She ducked into the narrow entrance of a convenience store, pretended to look at items on a shelf near the window, and watched through the glass as both men slowed outside. They were not together in the way that friends are together. They stood a few feet apart, scanning the street, communicating in small glances that said everything she needed to know. They were professionals, and they had been told to bring her somewhere. She did not know yet what she had done. She did not know yet what she represented. She only knew that she had to get out of that store through the back, and she had to do it before they decided to come inside. The store owner, a tired man in his 60s, barely looked up when she asked quietly if there was a back way out. Something in her tone, steady, direct, without panic, made him point toward the stockroom without asking a single question. She thanked him, walked through shelves stacked with canned goods and bottled water, pushed open a heavy door, and stepped into an alley that smelled like rain and old cardboard. She walked fast, not running, until she reached the end of the alley and turned into a wider street 3 blocks from her apartment. She pulled out her phone. The battery was at 4%. There were not many numbers she knew by heart. She had always relied on her phone's memory, the way most people did, storing contacts and forgetting numbers entirely. But there was one number she had memorized without meaning to, a number her colleague BC had mentioned twice in the last month, once as a joke, and once not entirely as a joke. BC worked the night shift, and had once dealt with a stalker situation that lasted 3 weeks. She had called a private security firm called Crest. She had said, with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from experience, that they were the only people she had ever trusted with something she could not fix herself. Amara dialed the number. It rang twice. The man who answered had a voice that did not waste words. He said his name was Owen. He did not ask unnecessary questions. When she said she was being followed and she was a nurse and she had no idea why, he asked for her exact location, told her to stay moving but not to run, and said someone would reach her in 7 minutes. She was about to tell him she did not have money for private security, when he told her not to worry about that right now. Just keep walking. Her phone died 40 seconds after she ended the call. She kept walking. A dark vehicle pulled up beside her in exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The window came down, and a young woman with a calm face and a short, natural hairstyle said her name was Priya. She worked for Crest, and she was going to take Amara somewhere safe. Amara looked at the woman for 3 full seconds. She had learned to read faces in a hospital, which is one of the few places where a person's face tells the truth whether they want it to or not. And then she got in the car. She did not look back. The 2 men who had been following her reached the spot where she had been standing, 18 seconds later. They found nothing. One of them pulled out a phone and made a call. The voice on the other end did not respond well to failure. The voice on the other end had spent 20 years building an empire on the principle that there was no such thing as an obstacle that money could not dissolve. The fact that a 23-year-old nurse had slipped away into an alley was not, in his mind, a minor inconvenience. It was an insult, and Darius Mwamba did not absorb insults quietly. He was 61 years old, and he had started his career as a military officer, with real ambitions, and a uniform that he believed meant something. That belief had lasted about 4 years, before he understood that the people giving him orders were not interested in building anything worth believing in. So he had made a different decision. He had taken everything the military had taught him about planning, discipline, and patience, and he had applied it to a different kind of operation, one with no uniform, no flag, and no accountability. Over the following 2 decades, he had built a shadow empire that stretched across 6 countries. He had companies that did not exist on any official registry. He had people in offices whose job titles had nothing to do with their real function. He had accounts that moved through 4 different financial systems before the money touched anything traceable. And he had a network of intelligence operatives who fed him information that most governments would have spent millions trying to access. His name appeared on exactly 0 criminal records. He sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations. He had been photographed at a UN summit. He donated to hospitals. He also had a private list, not written anywhere, not shared with anyone, of bloodlines that needed to disappear before they could ever cause him a problem. He had been working through that list for years, methodically, without hurry. He was a patient man. The trouble with patient men is that they are very difficult to outrun for long. Amara's name had appeared on his list 6 months ago, flagged by a researcher inside a Lagos University archive who had been on Mwamba's payroll for 3 years. The researcher had been cataloging old documents from the 1980s, land records, political correspondence, treaty documents from a region of West Africa that had been absorbed, quietly and violently, into a larger administrative structure during a period of military consolidation. Buried inside a folder that had not been touched in 30 years was a name, and connected to that name was a lineage, and at the end of that lineage, currently working double shifts at Echo General Hospital and living alone in a 2-room apartment in Lagos, was a young woman who had no idea that she was standing on top of a historical claim worth more than the gross domestic product of a small nation. Mwamba had known about the claim for years. He had spent a great deal of time and money ensuring that the people who might pursue it were either gone, silent, or unaware. He had believed, until 6 months ago, that the bloodline had ended. The discovery that it had not ended, that it had, in fact, produced a living heir who was now 23 and healthy, and fully capable of eventually finding out the truth, was the kind of discovery that made a man like Mwamba reach for his private phone and make a call he did not make lightly. The bounty had gone out 48 hours after the researcher's report landed on his desk. $3 million, United States currency, deposited into any account the provider chose, for the safe delivery of one Amara Ose to a location that would be given upon confirmation of identity. The bounty circulated through channels that operated entirely outside of any legal framework. The people who received it were not the kind of people who needed it explained to them. They understood what it meant. They understood what safe delivery meant in practical terms. And they understood that Mwamba's payments had never, in 15 years of working with various operators, bounced or been delayed. Amara knew none of this when she sat in the back of the Crest vehicle and tried to control her breathing. She knew only that something had broken in the ordinary rhythm of her life tonight, and that the break felt serious. She was not a person who invented danger. She had worked in an emergency ward long enough to know the difference between real fear and imagined fear, and what she felt right now was real. The vehicle pulled into an underground garage beneath a building in Victoria Island. Priya walked her through a secure entrance, past 2 staff members who nodded without asking questions, and up a private elevator to a floor that felt nothing like an office and nothing like a hotel. It was something in between, functional and clean, with long windows and low lighting. Amara sat down in a chair near a table and accepted a glass of water, and did not speak until she had drunk half of it. Then a door opened, and a man walked in, and she felt the air in the room change in a way she could not have described if someone had asked her to try. He was tall. He moved without wasted motion, the way people move when they have spent years in situations where extra movement costs you. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and had the kind of face that looked like it had made many serious decisions, and had not found any of them particularly easy. His name was Owen Adeyemi. He was 38 years old. He ran Crest Security, which was not merely the Lagos office of some international firm, but an organization he had built himself from the ground up. after spending a decade and a half in covert military operations across 3 continents. He had a reputation in the circles that knew him, not a public reputation, because he had no public presence to speak of, as someone who did not take personal interest in cases. He assessed threats. He neutralized them. He moved on. He was known as the Alpha King among the few people in his industry who spoke in those terms, and they used the name not as a compliment exactly, but as a kind of shorthand for what happened when he decided something was going to be handled. He sat down across from Amara, put a tablet on the table between them, and looked at her. Not the way people look at someone they feel sorry for, the way people look at someone they are trying to understand. "Tell me everything," he said. And she did. She told him about the 2 men. She told him the time she had left the hospital, the route she normally walked, the moment she noticed them, the decision she made, the store, the alley, the phone call. She gave him details with the precision of someone who had spent years charting patient histories, and he listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, without looking away from her face. When she finished, he was quiet for about 5 seconds. "Have you had any contact with strangers in the last 2 weeks?" he asked. "Anyone who asked unusual questions about your family, your background, anything from before you came to Lagos?" She shook her head. "I grew up in Lagos. I have no family here. My mother passed when I was 16. I never knew my father's side of the family. There is nobody to ask about." Owen nodded slowly. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that the 2 men who had followed her were not amateurs, and were not acting on a personal grudge. The precision of their positioning, the distance they maintained, the coordination, it spoke of training and instruction. Someone had sent them, and whoever had sent them had given them her schedule, which meant there was surveillance in place before tonight. "You are going to stay here tonight," he said. "I need to make some inquiries. In the morning, we will know more." Amara looked at him. "I have a shift tomorrow at 7. "You will not be going to that shift," he said. She opened her mouth to object. "I know that is not what you want to hear," he said, and his voice was not unkind, just firm in the way that walls are firm. "But until I know who sent those men and why, your regular schedule is the most dangerous place you can be." She closed her mouth. She was practical above everything else. She had been practical her whole life, because practicality was the only tool she had ever been given. She looked at the glass of water in her hands, and thought about the 2 men on the street, and the way they had not spoken to each other, and the way they had looked at her, and she said, "All right." Owen stood. "Priya will show you where you can rest." He walked back toward the door. "You answered the phone yourself," Amara said, "at that hour." He stopped. "I just thought someone like you would have a receptionist," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I was already awake," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I am always awake at that hour," and he left the room. Amara sat alone in the quiet office, with the long windows and the low lighting, and she thought about that answer for a long time. There was something in it that she recognized, the particular kind of wakefulness that belongs to people who carry things alone, who have no one to share the weight of what they know with at 3 in the morning. She had been that awake many nights herself. She understood it in her bones. She did not know yet that Owen had already put 3 of his people on the street to pull footage from every camera within 4 blocks of where she had been followed. She did not know that within the hour, one of those feeds would return a face that matched a known operator who had worked for a network connected to General Darius Mwamba. She did not know that Owen would stand in front of that image at 2 in the morning, with his sleeves still rolled up and a cold cup of coffee on the desk beside him, and feel something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with professional assessment, and everything to do with the young woman who had walked barefoot into his building, with fury in her eyes, and talked about her 14-hour shift with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who had never once asked the world to feel sorry for her. She did not know any of that. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone in whatever was coming. And for a person who had been alone since she was 16, that feeling was the strangest and most terrifying comfort she had ever known. She lay down on the small couch Priya had made up for her, still in her scrubs, still with her hospital badge clipped to her chest, and she stared at the ceiling in the dim light, and she tried to sleep, and she did not manage it for a very long time. Outside, the city hummed on. Somewhere across Lagos, in a secured room that no official address could lead you to, a man with 61 years of patience and $3 million committed to her name, sat in front of a phone and waited for news that did not come. The two men he had sent reported in. The target had gone. The vehicle had not been identified. The woman had vanished as if she had simply stepped sideways out of the world. Mwamba ended the call and sat for a moment in the kind of silence that only belongs to people who are already planning what comes next. He was not alarmed. He was calculating. He had learned long ago that the first attempt was rarely the last. He had time. He had resources. He had patience built over 2 decades of making problems disappear before they became inconvenient. What he did not have was any knowledge of Owen Adeyemi. That, as it would turn out, was the most significant gap in his considerable intelligence network, and it was a gap that, over the weeks ahead, would cost him everything. But on that first night, the city did not know any of that yet. Lagos kept moving, kept breathing, kept turning its face toward morning. A young nurse lay awake in a building in Victoria Island and counted her own heartbeats to stay calm. A man with a cold cup of coffee stared at a face on a screen and made a decision he would not explain to anyone, not even himself, for a long time. And somewhere in the dark, a clock began to count down toward a confrontation that would reach across 30 years of buried history and shake the ground beneath people who had believed, until now, that the past stayed buried if you buried it deep enough. It did not. It never does. The morning after she arrived at the Crest building, Amara woke to the sound of voices in the corridor outside the room she had been given. Not loud voices. Low, measured ones. The kind that belong to people who have learned to deliver serious information without raising their tone, because raising your tone in a crisis costs you clarity, and clarity is the only thing that matters when a situation is already complicated enough. She sat up. Her scrubs were wrinkled from sleeping in them. Her badge was still clipped to her chest. She looked at the plain clock on the wall and saw that it was 6:43 in the morning, which meant she had managed about 4 hours of something that passed for sleep. She was used to functioning on less. The hospital had taught her that. She washed her face in the small attached bathroom, used the toothbrush that had been left on the shelf, and stood for a moment looking at her own reflection. She looked like herself. That surprised her slightly. She had expected the events of the previous night to show on her face in some visible way, but her face was composed and steady, and looked exactly as it always did, like someone who had seen hard things and had decided not to be destroyed by them. She came out of the bathroom and knocked on the door of the main room. A young man she had not seen the night before opened it and told her, politely, that Mr. Adeyemi was available if she wanted to join him. She followed the young man down a corridor and into a larger room with a long table and several screens mounted on one wall. Owen was standing near the screens with a woman in her 30s, who was introduced as Dr. Fola Aid, a researcher who worked with Crest on complex background investigations. Owen turned when Amara entered. He looked exactly as he had the night before, controlled, alert, as though he had either not slept or did not need to. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He sat across from her, and Dr. Aid remained standing near the screens, and the morning light came in through the blinds and put thin lines of gold across the table between them. "We identified one of the men who followed you last night," Owen said. He did not build up to it. He said it the way doctors deliver difficult news, directly, without decoration, because the person in front of him was not fragile and deserved the truth in its complete form. He is a known operator. He has worked previously with a network connected to a man named Darius Mwamba. Amara did not know that name. She said so. "Most people do not," Owen said. "That is intentional. He is 61 years old. He runs a private commercial empire across 6 countries. He has interests in land, resources, finance, and infrastructure. His public profile is that of a businessman and philanthropist. His actual profile is considerably different." Dr. Aid pulled up a document on the screen behind her. It was not a photograph, not a dramatic dossier. It was a set of archived reports, the kind that circulated among private intelligence analysts and certain branches of government security. Owen did not show Amara the classified parts, but he showed her enough. "We do not yet know with certainty why his people were following you," Owen continued, "but we know they were, and we know this man does not move people without a reason. He does not spend resources on mistakes or coincidences." Amara looked at the name on the screen. She said it quietly to herself, the way you say something you want to remember. Darius Mwamba. "The next step," Owen said, is to understand why he has an interest in you specifically. That requires looking into your background, your family history, anything that might connect you to something he wants or fears. He paused. I understand you told me last night that you have no family, but there is always a history. We need to find yours. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My mother left a box. Owen looked at her. When she died, Amara continued, she had a locked metal box. It was in her wardrobe. I was 16. I was dealing with her funeral arrangements alone, because there was no one else. I kept the box. I moved it with me when I moved apartments, 3 times. I never opened it. She paused. I told myself I was waiting until I was ready, but the truth is, I think I was afraid of what was in it. Where is the box now? Owen asked. My apartment. He looked at the young man who had brought Amara to the room, and without a word being exchanged, the young man nodded and left. Owen looked back at Amara. We will retrieve it today, with your permission. Yes, she said. There was a brief silence. Dr. Ad was making notes on a tablet. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered within 2 rings. The city outside was fully awake now, and the sounds of Lagos traffic filtered faintly through the walls. Amara thought about her apartment, the small space she had kept clean and organized, and very spare, because she had learned early that things you own become things that can be taken from you, so it was better to own only what you truly needed. The box had been the exception. She had kept it for 7 years without opening it, which was the longest she had ever held on to something she did not understand. Can I ask you something? She said. Owen looked at her. Last night you told me not to worry about payment. You sent a car for me in 7 minutes. You housed me here and fed me, and you are now sending someone to retrieve something from my apartment. What is this going to cost me? Owen was quiet for a moment, not the kind of quiet that means a person is calculating numbers. A different kind. Nothing right now, he said. We will have a full conversation about the situation once we understand what the situation actually is. The first priority is making sure you are not in immediate danger. Everything else comes after that. She studied him. You are not doing this because you think I can pay you. It was not a question. He heard it as the observation it was, and he did not deny it. No, he said. Then why? He looked at her with the kind of steadiness that takes years to develop. Because someone sent trained people after a nurse who works 14-hour shifts and walks home alone. That is not something I am able to look away from. She absorbed that. It landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She was not accustomed to people using their resources for her without wanting something immediate in return, and she did not know quite what to do with it except to file it somewhere and return to the practical facts of the situation. The box arrived at the Crest building 2 hours later. It was smaller than Amara remembered, a rectangular metal container, dark green, with a simple lock that had rusted slightly at the edges. One of Owen's team members had a set of tools that made short work of the lock, without damaging the box itself. He set it on the table in front of Amara and stepped back. She sat with it for a moment. Owen was in the room, but he stood near the window with his back partially to her, giving her a form of privacy that she appreciated more than she could have said. Dr. Adaid was at the table but looking at her screen. The young man who had retrieved the box had left the room. Amara put both hands on the top of the box. She thought about her mother, not the way her mother had looked near the end, which was painful to remember, but the way she had looked before that, in the years when Amara was small, and her mother had seemed like the most capable and self-contained person who existed in the world. Her mother had never talked about family. She had never talked about where she was from, beyond a general answer that named a region and moved quickly past it. She had never talked about Amara's father in any detail, only to say that he was gone, and the subject was closed. The box opened. Inside were documents, folded carefully, photographs, a small cloth pouch containing something she could feel but not yet see, and a letter, written by hand, in 2 different scripts, English and something else that she could read the letters of but not understand the meaning of. She recognized the second language vaguely. She had heard it once, she thought, in a lullaby her mother used to sing when she was very small. She picked up the letter first. The English portion was in her mother's handwriting, and it said, in part, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are old enough, and I am sorry I waited this long to tell you. Your grandfather's name was Emmanuel Osei. He was not a private man. He was a leader, and what he led was taken from him by force, and from us by silence. The silence ends with you, if you choose it. But choose carefully, my love, because choosing means being seen, and being seen has a cost I was not always willing to pay. Amara set the letter down. She looked at the photographs. An older man in formal dress, standing in what looked like a government hall of some kind, shaking hands with several officials. The same man in a village setting, surrounded by people, laughing. A younger woman, her mother, perhaps 20 years old, standing beside him, who looked so much like Amara that Dr. Odd, who had glanced over from her screen, quietly said nothing, but felt the resemblance as something almost startling. Owen moved to the table. He looked at the photographs without picking them up. He looked at the document nearest the top of the pile, which had a seal on it, an official seal, old and faded, from a governmental authority that had been dissolved in 1984. Your grandfather, Owen said. It was not a question. Apparently, Amara said. Her voice was very steady. She had trained it to be steady, over years of delivering difficult news to patients' families. She was using that training now. Dr. Adaid had already opened a new search window on her tablet. Emmanuel Osei, she said quietly. I know this name from the archive records. He was the administrative leader of the Asante Bono Territorial Council, an autonomous regional body that operated under a negotiated agreement with the national government. In 1984, the agreement was revoked by military order. The council was dissolved. The land and resource rights it held were absorbed into the national administrative structure. She paused. The military officer who signed the dissolution order was then Colonel Darius Mwamba. The room was very quiet. Amara looked at Owen. Owen looked at Amara. He destroyed my grandfather's council, she said slowly, and now he is coming after me. The land that council held, Dr. Ade said, and her voice was careful and precise, includes mineral deposits that were mapped in the 1990s and are now estimated to be worth somewhere between $4 and $7 billion at current extraction values. There is no active claim on that land in the National Registry, which means the only thing that could complicate Mwamba's ability to eventually access those resources through his commercial networks would be a surviving legal heir to the original council leadership, presenting a documented lineage claim in an international forum. Amara sat very still. The photographs were in front of her. Her grandfather's face looked up at her from 40 years ago, and he looked like her, the shape of the jaw, the directness of the eyes, the set of the shoulders that said, this person is going to stand their ground no matter what is in front of them. So he is not just trying to silence me, she said. He is trying to protect billions of dollars. Yes, Owen said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and the $3 million he offered for me? That is not very much, considering what he stands to protect. Owen almost looked surprised. Then something in his face shifted, and he said, no, it is not. That means he is not afraid of me, she said. He just considers me a loose end. For now, Owen said, if you ever filed a legal claim, he would spend considerably more, she finished. Yes. She looked at the photographs again. She picked up the one of her grandfather standing in the government hall, looking like someone who belonged there, who had built something real and believed in it. She held it carefully. My mother spent her whole life running from this, she said. She changed her routine, kept her head down, never talked about where we came from. She died at 41, from a condition that could have been treated earlier, if she had not been so afraid of drawing attention. She set the photograph down. She was afraid her whole life, and it still ended too soon. Owen said nothing. There was nothing to say to that, and he understood it. I am not going to spend my life running, Amara said. She looked at Owen. He looked back at her. The morning light was full in the room now, and the city outside was fully alive. And somewhere far away from that building, a man who had spent 20 years treating people as problems to be solved was planning his next move. But in that room, at that table, something had shifted. Something had been decided, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and completely, the way the most important decisions always are. I need you to tell me everything you know about him, Amara said, and then I need you to help me understand what it would take to fight back. Owen sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at her with the full attention of a person who had stopped thinking about this as a case somewhere around the moment she had walked into his building, and who had not yet found an honest way to explain that to himself. "All right," he said. And they began. Outside Lagos, in a quiet suburb, where the streets were wide, and the houses sat behind walls that said clearly that the people inside did not want to be found, a man named Darius Mwamba received a second report. The target had not been recovered. The Crest vehicle had been tracked to Victoria Island, but had lost the operatives on entry into a secured garage. The target was inside a building belonging to Owen Adeyemi. Mwamba had heard that name before. Not often, but enough. He sat for a moment with the information, turning it over in his mind the way a craftsman turns a difficult piece of material in his hands before deciding how to cut it. Then he picked up his phone and made a different call. Not to the men he had sent the night before, to someone with a longer reach and a higher clearance and considerably fewer moral objections to how a problem got resolved. "I need to know everything about Owen Adeyemi," he said, "and I need it by morning." He ended the call and looked out of his window at the garden his staff maintained to perfection, and he thought about a girl who had grown up not knowing who she was, who had survived on her own since she was 16, who had walked into the wrong building at the wrong time, and stumbled onto a decade of careful planning that he was not going to allow to be undone. He had been patient for 20 years. He could be patient a little longer. He did not yet know that patience, in this case, was not going to be enough. The third day inside the Crest building was when Amara began to understand the full shape of what she was caught inside, and it was the day she also began to understand the full shape of the man who was helping her navigate it. Owen Adeyemi did not talk about himself unless asked, and even then, he answered in the most direct way possible, without adding anything that was not strictly necessary. She had learned, in the 2.5 days since arriving, that he had served in military intelligence for 9 years after leaving the university, that he had operated on contracts in locations he never named, and that he had left the service at 30 and spent 5 years building Crest from nothing. She had learned that he ran a team of 18 people, that he had offices in 3 cities, and that he had a habit of arriving at work before anyone else and leaving after everyone had gone. She had also learned that he made terrible coffee, that he had not once looked at his phone for a personal reason in her presence, and that when he was thinking hard about something he went completely still, in a way that made the air around him feel different. She found herself watching him more than she intended to. This was inconvenient, and she was aware of it, and she pushed it to one side, because there was nothing useful about it, and she did not have the luxury of being anything other than focused. She had a bounty on her name. She had a grandfather's legacy buried under 30 years of deliberate silence. She had a man with 61 years of experience, and $3 million committed to her disappearance. She did not have time for anything that was not directly related to surviving this. What she had not accounted for was the particular intimacy of crisis. When you spend 72 hours in close proximity with someone, eating at the same table, working through the same problem from different angles, sharing the same information, you learn things about that person that normal social situations take months to reveal. She knew by the third day that Owen slept very little and worked through the night on most occasions. She knew that he was precise and methodical, but not inflexible, that when new information arrived he adjusted his thinking without resistance, which was rarer than people realized. She knew that he was hard on his team, in the sense that he expected complete accuracy and total honesty, and that his team gave him both willingly, because they could see that he held himself to the same standard, with no exceptions. She also knew, though she had not been told directly, that he had not taken a personal security case in 4 years. His role now was organizational. He assessed, he directed, he managed. He did not personally sit in operations rooms at 2 in the morning, looking at footage from street cameras in Lagos. And yet he had done exactly that every night since she arrived. On the third morning, Dr. Fola Ad presented a summary of everything the team had reconstructed about Mwamba's operations. It was comprehensive and deeply uncomfortable to look at. The man's network extended through import and export companies, through private financial institutions, through connections to local government officials in 3 countries who owed their positions, directly or indirectly, to his support. The land claim that Amara's grandfather had once held was embedded within a larger commercial framework that Mwamba had been quietly building for 15 years, in anticipation of a day when he might want to move forward with extraction operations. He had not done so yet, which suggested he was waiting for the right political moment. The presence of a living heir to the original claim, even an unaware one, was a complication he could not leave unresolved. If she filed a claim, Dr. Ade said, looking at her tablet, through the right international forum, it would not be easy for him to proceed. It would not be impossible either. He has deep connections. But it would create a legal obstacle that could take years to navigate, cost him significant resources, and draw the kind of attention he has spent 2 decades avoiding. Which is why he wants her gone, Owen said. Yes. Amara was looking at a map on the screen. The region her grandfather had led was green and mountainous on satellite imagery, sitting in the interior of a country she had never visited, with rivers running through valleys that she had never seen. It looked, to her eyes, like something worth protecting. She could understand why her grandfather had fought to hold it. If I filed a claim, she said, would it be valid, legally speaking? Dr. Ade glanced at Owen before answering. Potentially. The documents in your mother's box include the original territorial agreement. They include proof of lineage going back 3 generations. In the right legal framework, with the right representation, it is a credible claim. It is not a guaranteed one. But it is credible. And in the meantime, Amara said, while the legal process worked through whatever it worked through, Mwamba would still be trying to reach me. Yes, Owen said. She nodded. She had expected that answer. She thought about it for a moment, with the kind of practical steadiness that had gotten her through 7 years of adult life without a safety net. So the options are, she said, run and hide indefinitely, do nothing and wait for him to eventually find me, or go forward with the claim and deal with whatever comes with it. Those are the options, Owen said. Running does not work, she said. My mother ran. He still found me. If he has the resources to place surveillance on a hospital archive and pay researchers to monitor old documents, he has the resources to eventually find anyone. Owen said nothing. He was listening. Doing nothing, she said, means he wins without a fight, and the thing my grandfather built and died for stays buried forever. She looked at the map on the screen. So we go forward, she said. Owen looked at her for a moment. Then he said, going forward means accepting that the threat level increases significantly. Right now, you are a loose end he wants to tie up quietly. If you file a claim, you become a public opponent. He will not be quiet about it. I know, she said. It means staying under protection. It means changing your daily routine completely, possibly for a very long time. I know. It means trusting me, he said, and his voice was very level when he said it, and trusting this team, to keep you alive while the legal process does whatever it takes to do. She looked at him. The morning light was on his face, and there was something in his expression that was not quite neutrality anymore. She was a nurse. She read faces for a living. She read his. I already trust you, she said simply. I got in the car, didn't I? Something moved across his face briefly, gone before it settled into anything she could name. He looked back at the screen. Then we prepare, he said. For the next 3 hours, the team laid out an operational plan. Amara would be moved to a secondary location that was off any registry connected to Crest's official offices. 2 of Owen's most experienced people would be with her at all times. Dr. Ad would begin the process of connecting with a legal contact who specialized in international territorial claims. Owen would begin running a parallel investigation into Mwamba's network, looking for pressure points, things that could be used, if necessary, to slow him down through legal and financial channels before the claim even reached a forum. It was a solid plan. It was the kind of plan that Owen built, thorough, layered, with contingencies for the contingencies. What it did not account for was the fact that by the time they were finalizing the 3rd layer of it, Mwamba had already received his intelligence report on Owen Adeyemi, and had already identified a weakness. Not a tactical weakness, something more personal. Mwamba's researcher had found, buried in an 8-year-old file from a government inquiry that had been closed without conclusion, a name connected to Owen's. A name that Owen had not spoken aloud in 4 years, and that he believed was safely in the past. A name that Mwamba now held in his hand like a key, turning it slowly, considering what door it might open. Leverage. That was always the most elegant tool. Not force. Not money alone. The right piece of information, applied to the right person, at the right moment, was worth more than any bounty. He would not use it yet. He would wait. He would watch. He would see how the nurse and the security man moved, and where they went, and what they were planning. And when the moment was right, he would press. He had been patient for 20 years. He had learned that the best time to strike was not when your opponent was off guard. It was when they had begun, just barely, to believe that they might win. That was the moment when everything they had built could come apart in a single move. And Mwamba was very, very good at that move. The safe house Owen moved Amara to was a property in a quiet area, outside Lagos, that had no visible connection to Crest Security in any official record. It was owned through a holding company, registered in a name that had not been used in any other context for 6 years. Owen had 3 such properties in the Lagos area, maintained specifically for situations where a client's location needed to be completely untraceable. He had used them over the years for various operations. He had never personally stayed at any of them. He stayed at this one. He told himself it was a practical decision. The threat profile was high enough that remote management was insufficient. He told himself this for approximately 4 hours before he acknowledged, in the private part of his mind where he was still entirely honest with himself, that the real reason he was sleeping in the building where Amara was staying had considerably less to do with operational judgment than he was comfortable admitting. The property had 4 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, and a secure communications setup that his team had installed within hours of the decision to relocate. Priya and a man named Leon were the on-site team, both experienced, both reliable, both professionally tactful in the way that people who work for Owen tend to be, after they have been with the organization for more than a year. They understood, without needing it explained to them, that their job was to be present and available, and to not observe anything they were not professionally required to observe. Amara adapted to the safe house, with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. She asked for a list of what was available in the kitchen, and made a meal for the entire team on the second evening, which surprised everyone, and was noticeably better than the food they had been ordering in. She borrowed a set of medical textbooks from a supply of general reading materials on the shelf, and read in the evenings. She did not complain about the restrictions on her movement, did not push for exceptions, did not ask to contact people from her normal life. Though Owen had seen her look at her phone, which was being held by his team for security reasons, with the particular expression of someone who has patients they are worried about and cannot check on. He arranged, through a secure channel and a contact at the hospital, for Bisi, Amara's colleague, to be quietly informed that Amara was safe, but temporarily unavailable. He did not tell Amara he had done this until after it was done. When he did tell her, she looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that meant more than those 2 words typically carry. The 4th day was when the first complication arrived. Leon came to Owen early in the morning with a report from the overnight surveillance team. A vehicle had been parked on the road that ran along the northern edge of the property for approximately 3 hours during the night. The plates were registered to a logistics company in Abuja. The company appeared to be real, but had 3 directors with no verifiable public presence. The vehicle had left before dawn. Owen looked at the report, and then looked at Leon. "They know this location," he said. Leon nodded. "How?" "We are still working on that." Owen was already running through the possibilities. The location had been selected through a chain of decisions and purchases that should have been impossible to trace quickly. Either someone in his own network had made an error that he was not yet aware of, or Mwamba's intelligence capacity was considerably more sophisticated than any of the existing files on his operation suggested. He called the team together, Priya, Leon, and Dr. Aid, who was connecting remotely, and laid it out plainly. They needed to move Amara again, this time further, and through a route that would take 2 full days, and involve crossing into a neighboring country, where Owen had a contact who could provide a clean location, with no prior connection to anything in the current operation. He was about to go and tell Amara when she appeared in the doorway of the room where the team was gathered. She looked at their faces. She was perceptive in the way that people who spend years reading patients are perceptive. She had learned to walk into a room and understand its emotional weather before anyone spoke. "We need to move," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Owen said. She looked at the wall for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "How long do I have to pack?" 20 minutes, Owen said. She nodded and went back toward her room. She was ready in 17. The convoy left the property at 5:30 in the morning. They took a route that Owen had selected specifically because it moved through areas with minimal camera coverage, changing vehicles once at a point that had been arranged the night before. Amara sat in the back of the second vehicle beside Owen, and for a long stretch of road neither of them spoke, watching the pre-dawn landscape move past the windows. Then she said, "He found us faster than you expected." "Yes," Owen said. "What does that mean?" He was honest with her, because he had made a private decision early on. That honesty was the only thing he would give her, that was not complicated by everything else. "It means his intelligence operation is better than we estimated. Or it means there is a gap somewhere in how we set up this location, possibly both." She thought about that. "Is there anyone on your team you do not completely trust?" He looked at her. "I am not accusing anyone," she said. "I am asking a genuine question. Because the way he moves, the speed of it, it seems like someone who gets information quickly, not someone who is searching for it, someone who receives it." Owen was quiet for a moment. He had been thinking the same thing since Leon's report. He had not wanted to think it, which was exactly why he had to. "There is a possibility," he said carefully, "that the location was compromised through technical means rather than through a person. We are still checking. But you are also considering the other possibility," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded and looked back out the window. The road was empty at that hour, and the sky was beginning to lighten at the far edge, the darkness thinning into gray in the east. There was something very specific about being in transit before dawn, a feeling of being between one thing and another, not arrived anywhere yet, carrying everything with you, and unsure of what would be waiting when you landed. "I worked with a doctor once," Amara said, "who was one of the best diagnosticians I have ever seen. He could look at a patient's chart and catch things that 3 other doctors had missed. But he had one habit that cost him. He was so loyal to the people on his team that he could not see when one of them was not performing well. He had to be shown, very clearly, by someone outside the situation, before he could accept it. He said afterward that loyalty had blinded him to evidence that was there the whole time." Owen looked at her. "I am not telling you that story to make a point about your team," she said. "I am telling you because I think you already know what you need to know, and you are giving yourself a little more time before you let yourself know it." He was quiet for a long time. The vehicle moved through the early morning. The sky kept lightening. "You are very perceptive," he said finally. "I am a nurse," she said. "It is the job." He almost smiled. She saw it, the very edge of it, in the line of his mouth, and said nothing, because it felt like something that belonged to him, and she was not going to reach for it, unless it was offered. They drove in silence for a while longer. The city fell away behind them. The road opened up into something wider and less crowded, and the air through the vehicle's ventilation smelled different, cleaner, with something green in it. Inside the vehicle, between 2 people who were still figuring out what the other one was and what they might mean to each other, something was building quietly and without announcement. It was not dramatic. It was not a moment. It was more like the way light builds before sunrise, slowly, then undeniably, and then suddenly everywhere. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. Not yet. Back in Lagos, in a secured room with a view of a garden that stayed perfect no matter the season, Darius Mwamba looked at his phone and read the report from his overnight surveillance team. The target had moved. The convoy had been tracked for 11 minutes before it was lost. He looked at the time on his report and the time on his watch, and noted that Owen Adeyemi had moved faster than expected. He had been told that Adeyemi was good. He had not, until that morning, fully appreciated what good meant in practical terms. He put the phone down and looked out at the garden. Good opponents were not a problem for him. They were the reason he had spent 2 decades building the kind of network he had built. He had not maintained an empire for 20 years by being reckless or reactive. He had done it by being thorough, and the one thing he had that even the most capable opponents struggled to counter was the leverage he had not yet used. He picked up a different phone. This one was older, with a number that did not appear in any registry. He sent a single message to the person at the other end. 3 words. "It is time." He set the phone down and waited. He was a patient man. But his patience, this time, was beginning to have edges. The crossing into the neighboring country happened at a border post that Owen had used twice in the previous 5 years, for operations that required absolute discretion. The official who managed the post was not corrupt in the conventional sense. He was simply a man who had worked with Owen long enough to understand that when Owen moved people quietly, it was for reasons that were, on balance, more legitimate than most of the paperwork that crossed his desk in a normal week. The convoy cleared the crossing in 12 minutes and continued north, along a road that the maps showed as minor, but that Owen knew well. The new location was a property belonging to a retired judge named Elliot O'Ware, who owed Owen a debt from several years ago that he had always offered to repay in the form of access to his very private, very well-secured country home. The home was 4 hours from the border, in an area where the nearest town was 30 minutes by road, and where a vehicle on the main approach was visible from the property for long enough to be prepared for. Judge O'Ware was traveling internationally and had agreed without hesitation to make the house available. His caretaker, a woman named Grace who had been with the property for 12 years, was the only person on site when the convoy arrived. Amara walked into the house and stood for a moment in the entrance, taking in the high ceilings and the old wooden furniture, and the wide windows that looked out over a garden that ran down to a low wall beyond which, in the middle distance, green hills sat under morning cloud. It was a very different world from the two-room apartment in Lagos. It was a very different world from anywhere she had spent time in her 23 years. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. She did not say it as someone admiring a luxury. She said it the way someone says something when they are surprised to find beauty in a moment that is otherwise entirely defined by fear. Owen heard the difference and looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to it. The team set up quickly. Leon and Priya took the rooms nearest the main entrance. Owen took a room at the far end of the corridor that had a view of the approach road. Amara was given the room with the garden view, which was the largest in the house, and which Grace had prepared with quiet efficiency, putting fresh flowers on the windowsill, with the practical warmth of someone who believed that flowers mattered, even in difficult circumstances. By mid-morning they were settled, and Dr. Aid was connected remotely, and the work continued. The legal strategy was Dr. Aid's primary focus now. She had been in contact with a barrister named Patrick Cole, who worked out of London and specialized in international land and resource claims, with connections to colonial-era and post-colonial administrative disputes. He had handled 4 similar cases in the previous decade, with mixed results. But he was respected, and he was honest about the difficulties. When Dr. Ad briefed him, he asked questions for 40 minutes, and then said that the documents from Amara's mother's box were, if authentic, genuinely significant. He said he would need time to examine them properly, and that the process of building a credible claim was not fast, but it was possible. "Months?" Dr. Aid asked. "Months at minimum," he said. "Possibly longer, depending on the political environment in the country where the claim would be filed." She relayed this to Owen and Amara. Amara took it without visible distress. She had expected it to take time. What she had not expected, or rather, had not let herself fully think about, was what those months would look like. Months of safe houses, months of restricted movement, months of living alongside people she had met 1 week ago, in a situation she had not chosen, dependent on the judgment and good intentions of a man she had spoken to for a total of perhaps 20 combined hours. She thought about this in the afternoon, sitting in the garden while Priya worked nearby, and the hills sat still under their cloud. She was good at being alone. She had been alone for a long time. This was a different kind of alone, surrounded by people but still fundamentally isolated from her own life, from her patients, from BC and the other colleagues she liked, from the small routines that had made up her days, from the work that was not just a job, but the reason she got up before dawn and pushed through exhaustion and the weight of other people's pain. She was still sitting there when Owen came out of the house and sat down in the chair 2 positions away from hers, not close, not distant. He had a folder in his hands and looked like he had come out for a specific reason, but he set the folder on the table and looked at the hills for a moment before saying anything. "How are you managing?" he asked. She looked at him. Nobody had asked her that in 4 days. "I am fine," she said, which was the answer she always gave, the answer she had given so many times in her life that it came automatically, even when it was only partially true. He looked at her. She changed her answer. "I miss my work," she said. "I miss having a purpose that is not just surviving." He was quiet for a moment. "The claim is a purpose," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But it is not mine in the same way. Medicine is mine. I chose it. I built my life around it. This. She gestured briefly at the garden, at the hills, at the situation itself. This was chosen for me, by a man I have never met who decided 60 years ago to take something that belonged to someone else. Owen looked at the hills. I understand that, he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he was not offering empty sympathy. He was speaking from somewhere he knew. She looked at him. Do you? He was quiet for a moment longer than usual. I left the military because someone else's decision defined the direction of my life, in a way I had not agreed to, he said. It took me years to turn what they did into something I chose, rather than something I was reacting to. He paused. I am not saying it is the same situation. But you know what it is to have your life redirected without your permission, she said. Yes, he said. She nodded. They sat quietly for a few minutes, looking at the hills. A bird called somewhere in the garden. Once, then was gone. The cloud over the hills shifted slightly, and a narrow column of sunlight came through, and lit a section of the far slope bright green. Will you tell me about it? She asked. The thing that redirected you. He looked at her. It was a long look, measuring something. Not today, he said finally. All right, she said, and she meant it. She did not push, because she understood the particular kind of reserve that comes from carrying something you have not yet found the right moment or the right person to put down. She had carried her own things that way for years. They sat in the garden for another half hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with Mwamba or the claim or the safe house. She told him about a patient she had once spent 6 hours stabilizing, who had arrived in the emergency ward having been told by 3 different clinics that there was nothing they could do, and she had found the thing they had missed, and the patient had sent her a note 6 months later, saying he had watched his daughter take her first steps. Owen told her, in response, about a retrieval operation years ago in a country he did not name, where the person he had been sent to find had refused to leave until Owen sat with him for 2 hours in a room while he finished writing a letter to someone, because the letter mattered more to him in that moment than his own safety. Did you wait? Amara asked. Yes, Owen said. Why? Because some things matter more than the schedule, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills again, but his jaw was slightly less set than it usually was, and the space around him felt slightly less like a fortress than it typically did, and she filed all of that away very carefully and said nothing about it at all. Inside the house, Leon was reviewing footage from the approach road cameras when he noticed something in the data log that made him very still. He went over it twice to be sure. Then he got up and went to find Owen. Owen read the log Leon gave him, and his expression did not change, but his eyes did. Something went through them that was fast and cold and very focused. The data showed that in the hour before the convoy had departed the first safe house, the secure channel that the team used for internal communications had been accessed from an external IP address for approximately 4 minutes. The access had been masked, but the mask was not perfect. It had left a trace that was only visible when you knew what to look for. Someone had been listening. Someone inside the team's own communication system had let someone else in. Owen looked at the IP trace. He ran it through 3 verification steps. Then he sat for a long moment and thought about the doctor that Amara had described that morning, the one who had been too loyal for too long, who had stayed blind to something he did not want to see. He thought about a man named Cato Brooks, who had been with Crest for 11 years, who had fought beside him in situations where your trust in the person next to you was the difference between coming home and not coming home, and whose sister had been hospitalized 18 months ago under circumstances that Owen had never fully investigated because he had trusted without questioning. He thought about that, and then he made himself think about it clearly, without the loyalty getting in the way Amara had described. He looked at the evidence in front of him. He held it honestly. And he knew. He did not say anything about it to anyone yet. He needed to be certain, and he needed to manage it correctly, because the wrong move would tell Mwamba that Owen knew, and Mwamba would adapt, and they would lose the one advantage they currently had, which was that Mwamba believed his access to the team's communications was still secure. Owen stood up and walked back toward the garden. Amara looked up when he came back. She read his face in half a second. Something happened, she said. Yes, he said, but it is being handled. She studied him. She did not ask more. because she could see that he was in the middle of processing something that was personal as well as operational, and she understood that some things needed to be worked through before they could be spoken about clearly. "All right," she said. He sat back down in his chair. The hills were still there. The light was still on them. The bird was somewhere in the garden, quiet now. "Thank you," he said, after a moment, and she understood that he did not mean for anything specific. He meant for the space she had given him. For the patience that did not feel like patience, because it did not feel demanding. For sitting with him in the garden, and talking about a patient, and a letter, and things that mattered more than the schedule. She looked at the hills and said, "Of course." And in that quiet afternoon, in a garden that neither of them had chosen, in a country that was not their own, with a problem that had not been resolved, and a danger that had not been eliminated, something between them settled into place, with the kind of certainty that does not need to be announced, because it is already simply true. The night Owen moved against the breach inside his own team was one of the most difficult he had navigated since leaving the military service. Not because it required physical courage. He had spent enough years in situations that demanded that to know he was capable of it. What this required was a different kind of hardness, the kind that operates quietly, without the clarity of a direct threat, without anything to push against, except your own reluctance to believe that someone you had trusted completely had been, without telling you, slowly walking a line on the other side. Cato Brooks had been with Crest for 11 years. He had been on the founding team, back when Owen had no offices and no clients, and was running operations out of a rented warehouse in Port Harcourt, with 3 people who believed in what he was building, before there was anything to show them. Cato was one of those 3. He was methodical, calm in a crisis, and had a quality that Owen had always valued more than any technical skill. He genuinely cared about the outcome of the work, not just the result, but the rightness of it. Owen had trusted him with things he would not have trusted to anyone else. Which was why, when the IP trace confirmed what Owen already knew, he sat alone in the room, at the end of the corridor for a long time, before he did anything at all. He did not blame himself for trusting. Blame was not a useful tool. He assessed the situation the way he assessed all situations, clearly, without emotion coloring the analysis, looking at what was true and what needed to happen next. What was true was that Cato had given an external operator access to the team's secure channel. What needed to happen next was to understand why, and to handle it in a way that protected the operation, without triggering Wamba's network into immediate action. He called Dr. Ade on a separate line that had never been connected to the compromised channel, and briefed her in 3 minutes. She was quiet, and then said, "What do you need from me?" "Keep working on the legal strategy as normal," he said. "Do not use the main channel for anything sensitive from this point. Everything operational comes through the secondary line." "And Cato?" she asked. "Leave that to me," he said. He brought Priya and Leon in separately, on the secondary line, and told them the same thing, without revealing the full picture. They were professionals. They adjusted without drama. Then he waited until morning. He found Cato in the kitchen at 6:15, making the kind of strong tea that he had always made, in the same way he had always made it. 2 bags, no sugar, left to steep for exactly 4 minutes. Owen had seen him make that tea 100 times, in 100 different safe houses and field locations across 11 years. He sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at him. Cato looked back. He was 44, with gray beginning at his temples, and the kind of face that had been through enough to be honest without trying. He held Owen's gaze for about 3 seconds. Then he looked down at his tea. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since yesterday afternoon," Owen said. Cato nodded. He wrapped both hands around his mug. He did not try to explain himself yet. He sat for a moment, in what Owen recognized as the particular silence of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has just been allowed to put it down. "Nadia," he said finally. Nadia was his sister. "Yes," Owen said. He had already pieced this together the night before, filling the gaps with what he knew, and what he had failed to ask about 18 months ago. What did they have on her? Cato looked up. His face was not the face of a traitor. It was the face of a brother who had been given an impossible choice and had made it badly. "They had her at a facility," he said. "Private. Medical. She needed something I could not afford. Someone came to me with an offer. Access for money. I said no the first time. He paused. The second time they told me if I did not, she would not get the treatment. Owen said nothing. I know, Cato said. I know exactly what I did. I know what it cost. I have been, every day since the first access, I have been waiting for this conversation. I thought you should know that. I was not comfortable with it. Not for one day. Being uncomfortable with something does not make it reversible, Owen said. His voice was even. Not cruel. Just precise. No, Cato said. It does not. They sat for a moment. Outside, the property was quiet. The morning was pale and cool, and the hills were beginning to come visible through the kitchen window as the light increased. Is Nadia safe now? Owen asked. Yes, Cato said. She has been for 8 months. But the access continued. Cato looked at the table. By then they had enough on me that stopping felt like it would make things worse. I know, that is not a defense. I know how that sounds. I am not trying to defend it. Owen looked at him for a long moment. What do they know? Through what you gave them. Cato was quiet. Then, slowly and completely, he told Owen everything. He took 40 minutes and he did not hold anything back, because there was no longer any reason to. Owen listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions at the end, both technical. Cato answered them accurately. When it was done, Owen sat back and looked at the window for a moment. The hills were fully visible now. Here is what is going to happen, Owen said. You are going to continue behaving exactly as you have been behaving. You are not going to give them anything new that is accurate. You are going to give them one piece of carefully constructed information that I will prepare, that will redirect their attention to a location we control. Cato looked at him. He had not expected this. If you do this correctly, Owen said, we can use the breach against them. If you deviate from it in any way, I will burn the whole operation to the ground, and you with it. Cato was quiet for a moment. You are going to use me as a channel, he said. Yes. Why are you giving me this rather than handing me over? Owen looked at him. Because handing you over destroys the one advantage we have right now. And because you have been a loyal person for 11 years, and a compromised one for 18 months. And those are not the same person. And I am capable of recognizing the difference. Cato's jaw tightened. He nodded once. You will not walk away from this clean, Owen said. When it is over, you are done with Crest. I will not report you to anyone, because doing so serves no one at this point. But we are finished. I understand, Cato said. Good. Owen stood. He picked up his own untouched coffee, and looked at it for a moment, and then set it back down. Make your tea, he said. Behave normally. I will have the information for you this afternoon. He walked out of the kitchen and down the corridor, and stood at the window at the end for a long time, looking out at the hills. He felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of any loss that is not dramatic, quietly, in the chest, where the things you trusted used to be. Then he picked up the secondary line and called Dr. Aid, and told her what they were going to do, and how they were going to do it. And by the time he reached Amara in the garden an hour later, he had constructed the full plan, and the worst of the weight had settled somewhere manageable. Amara looked at his face. She had learned it well enough by now to read the specific quality of what was there. You handled it, she said. We are handling it, he said. She nodded. She did not ask for details. She trusted him to tell her what she needed to know when she needed to know it, and he had not yet failed to do that. He sat down beside her and looked at the garden, and she sat beside him and looked at the garden, and between them was the particular kind of quiet that belongs to 2 people who have stopped pretending they are simply colleagues, and have not yet decided what to call what they actually are. In Lagos, a man named Darius Mwamba received a message through his intelligence channel. The message carried a location, a warehouse address in a city 2 hours from where Amara had last been tracked. His people confirmed, through their internal contact, that this was where Adeyemi was moving the target within the next 24 hours for a planned meeting with the legal team. Mwamba looked at the address. He looked at the timing. He made a decision. He was going to end this. Quickly, cleanly, before the legal process got traction. Before the girl with the nurse's badge and the grandfather's documents became something that an international forum would have to deal with. He called his best team and gave them their instructions. He told them to be prepared to move by morning. He had been patient for 20 years. He was almost done. Except that the warehouse was empty. and Owen Adeyemi was watching it from 3 separate camera positions, with 2 intercept teams standing by, and a direct line open to a contact inside the national security apparatus of 2 governments who had been waiting for exactly this moment to have something on Darius Mwamba that was current, documented, and completely undeniable. Mwamba's team arrived at the warehouse at 4 in the morning and found nothing but cameras and silence, and the particular feeling of a trap closing around them. The arrests happened cleanly. 6 men, all with traceable connections to Mwamba's operation. By 5 in the morning, Owen's government contacts had everything they needed to move on the wider network. By 7, Mwamba's private phone was ringing from numbers he did not recognize and would not answer. By 9, the garden at the country house was bright with morning sun, and Amara was drinking real coffee that Grace had made, and Owen sat across from her and told her it had worked. She set down her cup. She was quiet for a moment. "Cato?" she said. He looked at her. He had not told her Cato's name. "I noticed he was behaving differently yesterday," she said simply. "I did not say anything, because it was not my place." "He is safe," Owen said. "He is gone from the team." She nodded. She did not ask more. "It is not over," Owen said. "Mwamba himself has not been detained. The network is damaged, but not destroyed. The legal claim still needs to go through its process. This is not the end." "I know," she said. "But it is a very significant shift," he said. She looked at him. "Because of you," she said. He shook his head. "Because of you. You walked through the door. You opened the box. You decided to go forward." She looked at the garden. The sun was on the far wall now, and the flowers that Grace had put in her room that first day were still on the windowsill of the room behind her, still holding their color. She thought about her mother, who had run. She thought about her grandfather, who had not been given the choice to fight back. She thought about herself, at 16, standing in an apartment with a locked metal box, and no one to tell her what to do. "I want to go back to work," she said, "when it is safe enough. My patients need me." "I know," Owen said. "We will get there." She looked at him. "Will we?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. And he said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without hedging, plainly and completely, as a statement of what would happen, because he would make it happen. She believed him. She had believed him since the car. The weeks that followed the warehouse operation moved differently from the urgent, compressed days of the early crisis. They moved with the particular rhythm of a process underway, not resolved, not final, but no longer in free fall. The legal case was progressing through Patrick Cole's careful hands in London. The national security contacts that Owen had activated were building a case file on Mwamba's network that drew on the arrests at the warehouse and on a trail of documented transactions that Dr. Aid's research had been assembling for weeks. Mwamba himself had gone quiet. Not gone. Quiet. Which was its own kind of warning. Amara understood the difference between quiet and safe. She had grown up in rooms where silence sometimes meant nothing, and sometimes meant everything, and she had learned to pay attention to the quality of it. The quiet around Mwamba right now was not the quiet of a man who had accepted defeat. It was the quiet of a man who was reassessing. She returned to work in a limited capacity, 6 weeks after the night she had been followed through the streets of Lagos. Owen's team had worked with hospital security to create a protocol that allowed her to work 2 days a week in a modified schedule, with a member of his team present in the building at all times. She had pushed for 4 days. Owen had countered with 2 and explained precisely why. She had disagreed with 3 of his reasons and agreed with 2. And in the end, they had settled on 2 days with an agreement to reassess within the month. She stood at the nursing station on her first morning back and breathed in the smell of the hospital, that particular combination of disinfectant and effort and the background hum of life being very carefully maintained, and felt something settle back into place in her chest that had been slightly dislodged since the night she ran through the alley. BC found her at the station and hugged her without warning, which Amara returned with slightly more warmth than she usually brought to unexpected physical contact. BC did not ask questions she had not been invited to ask. She simply said, "You look well," in a tone that meant considerably more than that, and handed Amara a patient file and pointed her toward a room at the end of the corridor, and they went back to work. Leon was at the entrance of the building. Priya was in the car park. Owen was at the Crest office running operational management, and he called her at midday to ask how it was going, which was the kind of thing he did now. Called to check, sent brief messages with logistical updates, communicated more than strictly necessary from a professional standpoint. Neither of them had named that yet. Neither of them had found the right moment, partly because the right moment was hard to locate when your life was still being managed around a security protocol and a legal process and the ongoing quiet of a man who had not given up. It was BC, of all people, who made the observation out loud. She said it between patients, at the nursing station, over bad hospital coffee, in the direct and affectionate way that BC said most things. "The security man," BC said. "He calls you a lot for someone who is just doing a job." Amara looked at her patient file. "That is not a question," BC said. "I am just noting it." "Your observation is noted," Amara said. BC smiled and went back to her patient notes. Amara looked at the file in her hands and thought about the garden and the hills and the morning Owen had told her it had worked, and the way he had looked at her when he said it had not been professional, exactly. It had been something else. Something she had been trying to find a practical framework for, because practical frameworks were how she managed most things, and this particular thing was resisting all of her best organizational efforts. She was still thinking about it on the drive back to the safe house that evening when her phone rang. It was Owen. His voice was different, not in tone, because his tone rarely changed, but in pace. Slightly faster, more concentrated. "Where are you exactly?" he said. 3 minutes from the house," she said. "Leon is driving." "Tell him to pull over now," Owen said. "Not to the house. Pull over and wait." Leon heard this and was already changing lanes. "What happened?" Amara said. "We have movement," Owen said. "Mwamba's network. A vehicle convoy was spotted leaving a property connected to his commercial operation this afternoon, heading toward your current region. We are tracking it, but it is moving in a pattern that suggests they know the area." Amara was quiet for a moment. "How many?" "At least 4 vehicles," Owen said. "Possibly more. We lost visual on 2 of them 40 minutes ago." "So he made a move," she said. "Yes," Owen said. She looked out of the window at the empty road. Leon had pulled over and killed the lights. The road was dark and quiet in both directions. "What is the plan?" she said. "I am coming to you," Owen said. "With backup. 20 minutes. Stay in the vehicle, lights off, engine on." She stayed on the line with him. She heard him issuing instructions in the background, calm and direct, and very fast. The same Owen she had watched work for 6 weeks, but with something additional in his voice that she had not heard quite like this before. Something with a sharper edge, something personal. "You said you are coming yourself," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do not usually come yourself," she said. There was a brief pause. "No," he said. She understood the pause. She filed it carefully and said, 20 minutes. I will be here." He arrived in 18. The intercept that Owen's team ran that night was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was a controlled encirclement. 4 vehicles belonging to his team positioned in a pattern that blocked the 2 Mwamba convoy vehicles that had located Amara's position from reaching her, while simultaneously directing 3 of his people to keep the other 2 vehicles occupied on a secondary road long enough for Amara and Leon to change direction and move to a 3rd location. It was clean and precise, and left no one injured, and the Mwamba operators with no option but to retreat. They would come back. Owen knew that. This was not the last move. Mwamba was not the kind of man who accepted a failed operation as a conclusion. But by the time the convoy retreated, and Owen's team secured the 3rd location, something else had happened. The documents that Dr. Aid's team and Patrick Cole had been preparing for weeks had been formally submitted to an international forum through a legal contact in London. The submission was a matter of public record. It could not be unsubmitted. The claim existed in the world now, on paper, with a case number and a filing date, and the full documentation of Emmanuel Osei's lineage attached to it. Owen told Amara this, at 11:30 at night, in a small room, in a property she had not been to before. She sat on the edge of a bed that was not hers, and looked at the wall, and thought about her grandfather, and her mother, and the box that had sat locked in her wardrobe for 7 years. "It is filed," she said. "Yes," he said. "He cannot unfile it." "No, it is in the system now. The legal process has to run its course. His people cannot make it disappear. She looked at the wall for another moment. Then she looked at Owen, who was standing in the doorway of the room, and she said, "You were on the road tonight." "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. He was quiet. He came into the room and sat in the chair near the door. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked at her. "Because when they told me the convoy was moving toward where you were," he said, "I did not think about the protocol. I did not think about who was already deployed and whether they were sufficient. I thought about—" He stopped. He started again. "I thought about the fact that you were on that road." She held his gaze. "That is not professional," he said. "I am aware of that." "No," she agreed. "It is not." Silence. Not an empty one. "When you asked me, in the garden," he said, "about what redirected my life, I told you I would tell you another time." "Yes," she said. "I think it is another time," he said. She did not say anything. She waited. He told her. It took 20 minutes, and he did not leave out the difficult parts, which is the only way anything worth hearing gets told. He told her about the operation he had been on at 30 years old, the one he had not come back from entirely, not physically, but in the way that matters more. He told her about what he had seen, and what he had been ordered to do, and the line he had refused to cross, and what refusing to cross it had cost him, in terms of the career he had believed in. He told her that he had built Crest partly because he needed something to do with the skills he had, and partly because he needed to believe that there was a way to use those skills in a direction that felt like it meant something. He told her that he had spent 8 years not trusting that belief enough to let anyone close to it. She listened without interrupting. She watched his face. She saw what it cost him to say it, and she saw that he was saying it anyway. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere, a nightbird was calling. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me. It needed to be said," he said. She looked at him. "Owen." "Yes. The thing between us," she said, plainly and directly, the way she did everything. "We are not going to pretend it is not there." He held her gaze. "No," he said, "we are not." They sat in the quiet room, across from each other, in the middle of a situation that was not resolved, and a danger that was not gone, and a world that was considerably more complicated than either of them had planned for. And between them was something that had been building since the night she had walked into his building in her scrubs with her hospital badge and her 4% battery phone, and her complete refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. It was not simple. It would not be simple. Nothing about their situation was simple, but it was true. And both of them had spent enough time in situations where the truth had to be sacrificed for convenience, that they knew, without having to discuss it at length, that this was not one they were willing to let go of. "Rest tonight," Owen said. He stood up. "Tomorrow we work." "Yes," she said. He went to the door. He stopped. "Amara," he said. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "I would like to take you somewhere that is not a safe house." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like that." He left the room. She sat for a while in the quiet, listening to the night bird, thinking about fields that were green, and courts that were waiting, and a grandfather she had never met, who had built something real, and had it taken from him, and a mother, who had spent her whole life running from something that had found her daughter anyway. She thought about how she had spent 23 years being practical and self-sufficient, and deliberately small, and how none of that had actually kept her safe, and how the only things that had kept her safe were a good alarm in her chest that she had always trusted, and a phone call she had made on 4% battery to a number she had memorized without meaning to, and a man who answered his own phone at 2 in the morning because he was always awake at that hour. She lay down. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 8 weeks, she slept soundly. The morning that changed everything came quietly, the way the most important mornings often do. There was no announcement, no warning. Just a phone call at 7:45 that Owen took in the small kitchen of the safe house while Amara was still getting ready for the day, and a voice on the other end that belonged to his contact inside the National Security Division, who said 4 words before saying anything else. "We have him, Owen." The formal arrest of Darius Mwamba happened through a coordinated effort involving 2 national governments, an international law enforcement body, and a set of documents that had been painstakingly assembled over the preceding weeks, by a combination of Dr. Ad's research team, Owen's intelligence network, and the financial forensics firm that Patrick Cole had brought in on the legal side. The grounds were extensive. They included conspiracy to commit harm, coordinated illegal surveillance operations across multiple borders, financial crimes connected to the absorption of the Territorial Council in 1984, and direct documented evidence connecting him to the bounty placed on Amara's name. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was layered, corroborated, and airtight. It had taken 11 weeks, more near misses than any of them would later count comfortably, and the deliberate precision of people who understood that when you build a case against someone who has operated for 20 years without consequence, you cannot afford a single gap. Owen told Amara in the kitchen. He told her directly, the way he told her everything. She was holding a cup of coffee, and she set it down on the counter very carefully, as if she were suddenly aware of the weight of objects. She looked at the window. Outside, the morning was ordinary. Light on the garden wall, a bird on the wire, the hum of the world doing what the world does regardless of what the people inside it are going through. "He is in custody," she said. "Yes," Owen said. "The bounty," she said. "Void from the moment of arrest. His network is not going to spend money on a contract for a man who is in a cell." She was quiet for a long time. Not the kind of quiet that is empty. The kind that is full of things being processed, grief and relief, and something that is not quite either of those things, but lives in the neighborhood of both. "My grandfather," she said finally. "Yes," Owen said. She picked up the coffee. She held it in both hands and looked at the window for another moment. Then she said, "My mother spent her whole life afraid of this man, and he is 61 years old, and he is in a cell." Owen said nothing. He recognized that she was not saying it to him. She was saying it to the air, to the morning, to the version of her mother who had died at 41 carrying a locked box and a lullaby, in a language she had taught her daughter the sound of, without the meaning. "She never got to know," Amara said. "No," Owen said. She nodded once. She drank her coffee. She was completely steady. Not because she was not feeling anything. Owen had learned to read her well enough by now to know the difference between her steadiness and her emptiness. And this was not emptiness, but because she was a person who had always met hard things with her full self, rather than half of it. "What happens now?" she said. Owen walked her through it. The legal process for the claim would continue on its own timeline, which would be months, possibly longer. Patrick Cole was cautiously optimistic about the outcome, given the strength of the documents and the arrest of the primary person who had stood to gain from the claim being suppressed. The Territorial Council's land and resources would not come to Amara personally. She had been clear about that from the first conversation, and the legal framework agreed. What she was claiming was formal recognition of the Historical Council's legitimacy, and the right for the communities in that region to have access to and benefit from the resources within it, under a proper governance structure that would be established through a process she could participate in shaping if she chose to. She had chosen to. That decision had been made weeks ago, quietly, in a garden with hills in the background, and a cup of tea that was not very good, and a man who sat with her and listened, without advising, until she was ready to say what she already knew. "And the hospital?" she said. "You can go back," Owen said. "Full schedule. We will maintain a security protocol for some time. The network does not disappear just because the man at the top is arrested, but the threat level has dropped significantly. You can live your life." She looked at him. "Our life includes a protocol?" she said. There was a brief silence. Owen had not missed the word. He was very good at not missing things. "If that is what it is," he said carefully, "then yes. The protocol would cover both of us." She looked at him with the directness that had not wavered once in 11 weeks of crisis and safe houses and close calls and 2 in the morning conversations and a garden that had turned out to matter more than either of them had expected. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "Stop being careful about it," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face loosened slightly. The way a door that has been held shut by careful hands will loosen slightly when the hands finally decide to let it be. "I am not good at this," he said, "this particular thing." "I know," she said. "You are good at everything else." "That is not accurate," he said, and she saw the very edge of a smile. "It is close enough," she said. He moved to where she was standing, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because what needed to be said had been accumulating for 11 weeks, and did not need more words now. It needed something simpler than words. He put his hand against the side of her face, the way a person touches something they have been afraid of losing, and she put her hand over his, and that was how it happened. Without performance, without anyone watching. Just two people in a kitchen in the morning light, having gotten through something very hard together, and arrived somewhere neither of them had been before. Later that day she called BC. BC answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting for 4 minutes, and then said, "I am coming over," which was exactly the right response, and exactly what Amara needed, and which she did not argue with at all. BC arrived with food and sat across from her at the kitchen table in the safe house, and they talked for 3 hours, and it was the most ordinary afternoon Amara had experienced in 11 weeks, and it was extraordinary because of that. The next morning she went back to the hospital, full schedule, badge clipped to her chest. The wards smelled the same, and the corridors were busy, and the work was waiting, the way good work always waits. Not patiently, exactly, but faithfully. She walked into the first patient's room and introduced herself, and listened to the history, and looked at the chart, and began to do what she did, which was to find the thing that was wrong, and address it with everything she knew, and everything she was. At the end of the day she sat in the staff room, and drank bad coffee, and thought about her grandfather, who had built something real, in a place with green hills, and rivers, and communities, that had known who they were, until someone came and told them otherwise. She thought about the legal process that was working its slow way through to a result she had been told to be cautiously optimistic about. She thought about her mother, who had loved her without ever being able to explain why loving her required so much silence. She thought about Owen, who was at his office in Lagos running an organization, and had sent her 2 brief messages during the day, both of which were ostensibly logistical, and both of which were something else as well. She sent a message back. It was short, 4 words. It said, "Still standing. Come find me." His reply took approximately 90 seconds. It said, "Always." She finished her coffee. She got up and went back to the ward. She had 2 more patients to see before the end of her shift, and they needed her, and she was there, and that was enough. That had always been enough. The remarkable thing about Amara Osei was not that she had survived a bounty, or uncovered a hidden inheritance, or brought down a man who had operated above consequence for 20 years. The remarkable thing was that through all of it, she had remained entirely herself, practical, direct, clear-eyed, unimpressed by the magnitude of anything that tried to make her smaller than she actually was. That was the thing Darius Mwamba had never understood, and it was ultimately the reason he had lost. He had looked at her and seen a loose end, a problem, a number on a list of bloodlines to be erased. He had not seen the person, and the person was the thing that could not be bought, or intimidated, or erased with a bank transfer, no matter how many zeros were attached to it. Darius Mwamba's trial began on a Tuesday morning, in a courtroom that was open to the public, which was something he had never in his life anticipated sitting inside. He had been in official rooms before, boardrooms, government offices, summit halls where men shook hands in front of cameras. He had always been on the side of the room that held the power. He sat now on the other side of it, in a suit that was still expensive, but that hung slightly differently on him than his suits had always hung, as though the certainty had left the fabric along with everything else. The charges were read for 40 minutes. The courtroom was full. International press had been covering the case since the arrest, drawn by the combination of the territorial claim story, the bounty disclosure, and the sheer scale of the network that had been operating invisibly across 6 countries for 2 decades. The details were extraordinary even by the standards of people who covered extraordinary things for a living. Amara was not in the courtroom that morning. She had chosen not to be, which was itself a decision that told you something about her. She did not need to be in the room to feel the weight of it. She knew what was happening, and what it meant, and she had made her peace with the shape of it months ago. She was at the hospital. Ward 3, morning rounds. 3 patients who needed her full attention, and were going to get it. Owen was not in the courtroom either. He was at the Crest office, managing an operation in a different country, doing the work that he did every day. He and Amara had been together for 4 months by then, if together was the word for what they were, which was a conversation they had approached a few times, and then left open, because neither of them was in a hurry to put a label on something that was already clearly what it was. It was Priya who called Owen with the verdict, 6 weeks after the trial began. Guilty on 11 of the 13 charges. Sentencing to follow. Owen was on the line for 45 seconds, and then said thank you, and ended the call, and sat for a moment, looking at the window of his office. Then he picked up his phone and called Amara. She was between patients. She stepped into the corridor and answered on the second ring. He told her. She was quiet. 11 out of 13, he said. Which 2 did he escape? She said. The oldest charges, he said. The direct involvement in the dissolution of the council in 1984. The evidence was too old to meet the evidentiary standard at that specific charge level. The financial crimes and the conspiracy charges were different. She absorbed that. So not everything, she said. Not everything, he agreed. But most things. She was quiet for a moment. She was standing in a hospital corridor with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a monitor beeping steadily from one of the rooms nearby, and she was thinking about her grandfather, who had been 39 years old when his council was dissolved, and who had died at 52 of a heart condition, in a house much smaller than the one he had been forced out of. He is going to prison, she said. Yes, Owen said. For a long time. Yes. She looked down the corridor. A nurse she did not know well walked past and nodded, and she nodded back, and the hospital kept doing what hospitals do, which is keep going regardless. My grandfather would have laughed, she said. He would have laughed and said something very calm about how long it took, and then he would have gone back to work. What do you know about him? Owen said. More every day, she said. The historian Dr. Aide connected me with has been sending me research, documents, accounts from people who knew him. He was apparently known for being very calm in a crisis and very demanding in ordinary times, which I am told is not common. It is not, Owen said. He sounds familiar, she said. Owen was quiet for a moment. That is very generous, he said. It was not meant as a compliment, she said. It was meant as an observation. And yet, he said, and she could hear the very edge of the smile she had learned to listen for. And yet, she agreed. She had a patient to get back to. She told him she would call him after her shift. She stepped back into the room and picked up the chart and introduced herself to the woman in the bed, who looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is frightened, but trying not to show it. And Amara looked back with the particular expression of someone who has seen a great many frightening things and has not been destroyed by any of them, and something passed between them that did not require words. A simple, steady assurance that the person in the room was capable and present and entirely on your side. It was what she had always given. It was what she would keep giving. It was hers. The legal claim, when it was finally resolved 7 months later, went in Amara's favor in its essential points. The Territorial Council was formally recognized as having been dissolved without legal basis. The land and resource rights were returned to a governance structure serving the communities of the region. Amara was listed as the filing heir and received formal recognition of her grandfather's position, which meant something to her that she did not try to describe to anyone because some things belong entirely to the person feeling them. She did not move to the region. She had been asked, gently, by several people connected to the legal process, whether she intended to take a more active role in the governance structure. She said she intended to stay involved, to support, to travel there as often as she could, to know the place and the people her grandfather had served. But her life was in Lagos. Her work was in the hospital. Her patients were waiting. Owen had taken her there once, in the weeks between the arrest and the trial. They had driven up into the hills and looked out over the valleys and the rivers and the green slopes that her grandfather had known, and worked to protect and love the way you love something you have built with care over years. She had stood on a hillside with the wind coming up from the valley, and felt something she could not articulate settle into her in the way that rivers settle, not with drama, but with the patient persistence of something finding its correct direction. Owen had stood beside her. He had not said anything for a long time, which was one of the things she liked most about him. Eventually she said, "It is worth it." He looked at her. "All of it," she said. "Everything it cost. It is worth it." He looked out over the hills. "Yes," he said. She took his hand. He held it. They stood there for a while. The wind moved through the grass on the hillside, and the light moved over the valley below, and somewhere down in the direction of the nearest village, A sound rose that might have been singing, the kind that comes from a gathering, from many voices, not performing, just existing together, in the ordinary way of people who belong to a place. She did not know then that 3 years later she would visit the region for a community health initiative she had helped establish, bringing a small team of medical professionals who would spend 2 weeks providing care to communities that had limited access to it. She did not know that she would stand in a health clinic built on land that had once been outside anyone's reach, and feel the connection between what her grandfather had worked for and what she was doing as a single unbroken thread across 40 years. She did not know that Owen would come with her for part of that trip and spend 2 days working quietly alongside the local security coordination team, and would sit with her in the evenings under a sky full of stars that the city never shows you, talking about things that were not urgent and mattered enormously. What she knew, on that hillside with his hand in hers and the wind in the grass, and the sound rising from the village below, was enough. She was the last of her grandfather's line, and she had not been erased, and the thing he had built had not been buried forever, and the woman who had spent 23 years surviving alone had found, in the strangest set of circumstances that any practical person would have dismissed as implausible, a person worth standing next to. Not because she needed to, she had never needed to, but because choosing to, freely, with full knowledge, with her eyes open, was one of the best decisions she had ever made. And Amara Osei did not make bad decisions. Not anymore. Not ever again.